Hello and welcome to LA Currents. I'm Anita Bennett. Well, Los Angeles has a department dedicated to protecting residents from discrimination and leveling the playing field. So how do they go about doing all of that, and what types of cases do they take on? Joining us with some insight, we have Capri Maddox. She is the executive director of the LA Civil and Human Rights and Equity Department. And also we have Joumana Silyan-Saba. She is the director of Civic Participation and Human Rights. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here to talk about our department and the great work we do for the city of Los Angeles.
Excellent. So tell us about that work. What role does this department have in the big picture?
We were founded in 2020, appointed by our previous mayor, Mayor Eric Garcetti. We're very grateful for the privilege now to serve under the leadership of Mayor Karen Bass as we lift 5 commissions and fight hate, discrimination, and inequities on all fronts. We do this with about 40 full-time staff members and 41 commissioners, and we have a number of commissions. Our commissions are the Human Relations Commission, the Transgender Advisory Council, the Commission on the Status of Women, the Civil Rights Commission, which does enforcement, and we also have the Reparations Advisory Council. And so we are very, very grateful for all this work that we have to do with the city of Los Angeles. And I really think it's important to know that the city of Los Angeles is a place where the palm trees are beautiful and all of Hollywood's glitz is seen all over the world. But we have problems here, and we fight hate, discrimination, and inequities because don't let the palm trees fool you. We have challenges as it relates to hate cases soaring in the city of Los Angeles. But we fight it with our aggressive campaigns to address it by celebrating all cultures in Los Angeles. If you have a Heritage Month, we have a program to celebrate your community. We also want to be intentional on the offensive to make sure that we have our award-winning LAIsForAll campaign, where we are intentional to send a message in 21 languages that LA is for everyone.
We will come back to the LAIsForAll campaign, but what I want to know, Joumana, how do you enforce, when you say you're fighting discrimination, how do you enforce this?
Yeah, one of the pillars of our department is implementing the Civil Human Rights Law for the city of Los Angeles, which was signed in July 2019. And so within the purview of the law, we have the capacity to not only investigate, but we also have subpoena power. Implementing the law, which essentially prohibits discrimination or unequal treatment of anyone in the private sector. And so a big part of what we do in the department is to address discrimination in the private sector. And so our purview is limited to the private sector, and that is in education, employment, housing, and commerce. So as we implement the Civil and Human Rights Law, we have the capacity and the ability to investigate those claims as they come to us. And then we also have the power to also enforce penalties as well as corrective actions on as needed basis.
So are you working at all with the city attorney's office, or are you doing this enforcement in-house?
So the enforcement is within our department. So it is within the purview of our department to implement the human rights law, but to also do the enforcement of the law as well. When it comes to the penalties, and one of the things I really want to highlight about this law, we're not the only city that has it. There are other cities that have it, but LA in particular, in the way the law was written, it has a lot of teeth, which gives us the ability to not only implement penalties, which could go up to $125,000 or $250,000 if there is harassment or violence uncovered during the course of our investigation. So we have the ability to enforce those penalties, but we also can enforce corrective actions. Those are on a case-by-case as needed. And these are the kinds of things that the City of LA, the Civil Human Rights Law for the City of LA has that purview of enforcement. One really important thing about the Civil Human Rights Law is that it is complementary to the state laws. Oh. So we do work closely with our state colleagues as well. particularly when it comes to housing and employment. In that scope of work within housing and employment, we have a little bit of limitation, but that doesn't mean that we will not take anything that comes our way, whether it's our department that's going to enforce it or our colleagues at the state level who will enforce. So we will work closely with them. So it's really important that we do have those capacities and those relationships and understanding and recognizing that the civil human law that we have for the city of LA does have that depth to it and allows us to create the space for not only enforcement, but really our aim as a department is we want to prevent discrimination from happening in the first place.
Okay.
And this is where we have those opportunities for corrective action, for education, and the kinds of information that we want to put out in the community.
Capri, are there ever any cases that are too big for the department to take on? Let's say a corporation just has like widespread discrimination. How do you approach that?
So, great question. I want to tell you that there is no case too big for us. We want to be intentional to send a strong message that hate has no home in Los Angeles and discriminatory practices will not be tolerated. We are grateful we just had a big case against Smart and Final. It's a major corporation where there were practices happening with a bag check policy that were done in a discriminatory manner based on how someone looked. We had an African-American male that was asked.
So I'm sorry, bag check in terms of customers or
Yeah,
employees?
the customers,
Okay.
yes, the customer was asked to leave his bag at the front of the store, whereas other customers were not given such a security measure when they entered the store. And we had an African-American male who had the presence of mind to take pictures of other folks that were in the store to identify the fact that these folks were carrying their bags openly, and they actually weren't even aware of the bag check policy. So we want to make sure that we have equity in many spaces, and people need to be treated properly in the private sector. And one of the reasons this ordinance moved forward with a great deal of help from the city attorney's office, as particularly Mike Dundas at the time helped us write the ordinance. We wanted to be intentional to let folks know that we can bring a case against anyone, but it doesn't preclude folks from bringing cases in the private sector with the private attorney. And the thing that I think is important to share, when you're in the private sector, you are not immune or protected from being mistreated based on your background, okay? A lot of emphasis has been placed, especially when you think about policing, on discriminatory practices in government. But all day long and very frequently, people experience challenges when they're trying to enroll their child in an independent school, or how their children are treated at an independent school, or how people are treated in the housing market, employment, et cetera. And especially, like I said, in the stores, we've had a lot of issues and challenges in those spaces in the private sector.
Talk to me about discrimination in housing. You mentioned housing. How widespread is this problem in the city?
So, because we have jurisdiction limitations, and the state has a wide swath of that area, we have just a few areas where we can bring cases as when you think about housing. And in these spaces, maybe based on your financial ability to pay is something that's important, but how you pay. If someone mistreats you because you are a Section 8 tenant, that may be an issue. If someone is treated differently or not allowed to rent an apartment because they may have an accent, primary language is a protected class. And so we want to be intentional to let folks know that although we don't have the entire purview, like we can't do race or gender discrimination in those spaces with LA City, as Joumana mentioned, we actually will pass on those cases to our state partners.
Mm-hmm. What is discrimination in commerce?
So when you think about discrimination in commerce, that's like in the business setting. So again, when you the store example, there have been times where they'll say Veterans Day, people can come. If you're a veteran, we'll give you a discount or we'll give you a free item. And when certain people come into the store, maybe based on their background, there may be your identity, how you represent yourself, your preferred pronouns can be a way people discriminate against folks in the setting. There may be discriminatory practices in Airbnbs, for example, or I shouldn't pick on Airbnb as a company. There may be discriminatory practices
Short-term rentals.
with short-term rentals, where people may say, we will not rent our properties to women or veterans, or actually more realistic that happens is how people identify, who they love. And so when you think about those discriminatory practices, those are real issues. And let's just say this, a lot of emphasis is on how government, particularly law enforcement, handles discriminatory practices. However, there are many ways people have their knees on your neck in this world, and even in Los Angeles. And we want to be intentional to make sure that we hold those persons accountable as well, because the trauma and the impact of discriminatory practices really hurt you wherever it's coming from.
Mm-hmm. When you levy these fines, how much are we talking? How high can they go?
So the maximum is $125,000. But in cases where there is harassment or violence that's uncovered in the process or in the course of our investigation, that can go up to $250,000. The other thing with these fines is that once there is a notice of violation that's issued, the respondent has 30 days to pay the fees, and if they are not paying by 30 days, then 7% late fee will accumulate. And so there's also late fees that will accumulate. They do have 15 days to file for a hearing, but if they don't file within the 15 days, they have 30 days to pay those fines. You know, one thing about the fines, and that's really defined in the ordinance and how our fines are essentially decided, there are a number of factors that we look at. We look at the extent of harm. We look at the persistence of the behavior. We look at whether or not there were previous violations. Were there any attempts for corrective actions? And then we also look at the financial burden. I mean, the reality, and as Capri is saying, discrimination can happen essentially anywhere in the private sector. And so particularly when we start to look at commerce or even in housing, if this is a small minority-owned business, and we've actually had something along those lines where this was a small minority-owned business, and when we started to look at the penalties, you know, again, the penalties that, as we look at what the financial burden looks like, those are also going to be weighed in versus if we're talking about, you know, a huge corporation. And so those are the factors that we will look at as we consider the penalties, but the penalties are mandatory. There are two types of penalties. There is compensatory penalties and administrative penalties. The compensatory penalties are mandatory, and we may also charge additional administrative penalties as well, and plus late fees if those penalties are not paid. So there's a lot. Again, as I said earlier, the law makes it, you know, very, very clear and very intent when it comes to the enforcement.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate, because a $250,000 penalty, that's a lot for a mom and pop business, but for a major corporation, that's like the corporate lunch budget. So how do you, is it really a deterrent?
Yeah. So I want to tell you, first of all, I really want to thank Joumana Silyan-Saba for helping to put together our guidelines for this project with the help of the City Attorney's Office. Heather Aubrey, as well as Barack Vaughn, did a lot of work in this space in the early days. We now have an Assistant General Manager, Kim Kasreliovich, who runs our operation. But I just wanted to take a moment to thank Joumana for her leadership in this space. When you think about the penalty, it's not a big penalty, but you need to know that getting a penalty with us does not preclude other lawsuits from coming forward. For example, previously when I was in the City Attorney's Office, we handled unfair illegal business practice cases. It's Business and Profession Code 17200, where if you violate a law, you actually have a potential for someone out like the state or the city to bring a case against you for unfair illegal business practices. And that exposure is $2,500 per day per violation. So when you think about a major corporation doing violations on a regular basis, these dollars can add up. And when I was in the City Attorney's Office, we had cases in the tens of millions of dollars on a regular basis. So this may seem like a small case. However, it does not preclude folks from hiring their own private attorney or even another government entity seeking more stringent standards as we think about recovery amounts that are higher, much higher.
Mm-hmm. So what is the difference if, someone's having a problem and they come to you as opposed to a private attorney? What is the difference?
So, of course, if someone comes to a private attorney, a lot of instances, justice delayed was justice denied. And that is why Lola Smallwood Cuevas and the Black Worker Center, along with partnerships with IDEPSCA, CHIRLA, UCLA Labor, and others, stepped up to say we need to have local enforcement, because oftentimes a private attorney might say, I don't have the bandwidth for this case. It's only going to yield $5,000, $10,000. And when you think about the workup that may be needed, or they may not, have the access to records that we can acquire, it just might not happen. And you may be turned away from a private attorney unless you have a big, case in the, millions or at least a substantial amount of money where it makes sense for the firm to move forward. But in this case, local enforcement gives people remedies. And this is the beauty of, I see us as something between public interest law and big law, providing an opportunity for folks to have remedies. And the city is supporting this, and we couldn't be more grateful for the leadership of City Council to support us as we do this work.
Mm-hmm. What types of cases do you see the most often?
So we, again, I'll just tell you, year to date, we've received 861 inquiries.
Wow.
So we do get quite a large number of people reaching out to us. And, one thing that, Capri is exactly right, but one thing here to also consider when we're talking about discrimination, there's also an emotional impact. There's an aspect of trauma that goes with that. Mm-hmm. And even though we have people that come forward, and it may not be their ability to go to a private lawyer or an attorney and get it's really the recognition that harm has been done and that there's been discrimination. And so sometimes to even have that acknowledgement, it sort of not only remedies, but it gives that recognition. We do see quite a bit of calls come in related to housing, potential discrimination in housing. Our next one is commerce. So it's housing, commerce, and then we have education and employment where we see a little bit less. But predominantly it's been housing. It's really important to also understand that people do need support. They do need resources. So it's not always discrimination. Sometimes it's just a matter of us referring them to the appropriate resource. And so we've had quite a bit in that space, and our ability to, if it's not something that we can investigate, we will make sure that we connect that individual with the appropriate resources so they can get the assistance that they so need. and that's really an important part of what we do as well. It's, enforcement is important. We want to enforce, but as I mentioned earlier, there's also an aspect of this where we don't want to see discrimination, and to the extent that we want to make sure all of our residents are well served, if it's not something that is related to discrimination, we will make sure that they have the support and the assistance perhaps in other services.
You mentioned housing you see the most. Lately there's been a lot of cases nationwide where a person, tried to buy a house and they were appraised, let's say a black or brown person was appraised much higher than a Caucasian person. Do you get those kinds of cases?
Yeah,
and
Capri, I
just
think could probably talk a little bit more about that, but yes.
Right, and just to recap, I believe you were saying when you think about the appraisals, homes that are owned by people of color and women tend to be valued at a lower level.
Oh.
And there's so many discriminatory practices that happen in housing. I mean, there are even people of color who will set aside a friend, a Caucasian person, to show their home when the appraisal process is happening, or they may take their pictures off the wall to, make sure that it does not impact the value of their home. This is something that there's countless studies on, and I know Tavis Smiley on 1580 AM has had many shows in this space. So it is an issue. Another issue we actually are looking at is the fact that African Americans and Latinos pay about $1 billion more for their mortgages in America. Over about $1 billion more for their mortgages today compared to their Caucasian counterparts with the same credit score and job salary, et cetera. So when you think about, what I really mean to say is, when you think about African Americans and Latinos, they pay nearly $1 billion more annually for their mortgages compared to their white counterparts where they're similarly situated, when I'm talking about income, job history, salary, et cetera. I want to be intentional to tell you there are discriminatory practices that are happening with banks. Actually, banks even looking at surnames on how they handle and manage accounts. And that is something we're looking into right now in the city of Los Angeles.
A big bank or a regional bank, a national?
I won't get into too much details, but if I said the name, it's big enough for everyone to know.
Interesting. Wow. Well, the fact that you mentioned about people staging their homes, I have a friend who just sold their house in Porter Ranch, which is a city of LA. And the person, they're black, and they had some art from Africa and different things, and they told me, yeah, my real estate agent told me to take that stuff off the walls, and I'm like, why would it matter? And they said, because some people wouldn't want to buy from a black person. So I know exactly what you're talking about. In terms of renters, what do you see the most frequently?
So when you think about renters, and I'll pass this over to Joumana as well, one thing I want to say before we answer that question is, I think it's important to know that discriminatory practices have a direct connection to people becoming unhoused. It may be indirect, I should say, but it can result in people being unhoused. And that is why discriminatory practices in housing cannot be tolerated. There's also, when you think about housing discrimination, one thing we have happening on a regular basis of people calling us because they may speak with an accent, and the landlord is saying, there may be a citizenship issue, and that is a space where we cannot have discriminatory practices taking place in the city of Los Angeles. So using the perceived or actual citizenship status to not allow someone to have housing or to remove someone from their housing in a discriminatory practice cannot and should not be tolerated, particularly while we're having a housing crisis in the city of Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. What about if someone says they don't want to rent to people with children? Is that a form of discrimination?
The state actually has authority.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're absolutely right, Capri. The state will have more authority. I think the scope of our authority is really limited to citizenship status, primary language, and source of income. And I think on that point, we're seeing more of the Section 8 come through, people being denied, renters who are being denied rent because they're coming in on a Section 8. So that's an example of a source of income discrimination.
But how does that look? Do you take a voucher to, how does that look?
Section 8, so for, and feel free to jump in as well, but Section 8, if somebody is, they have a voucher, they're on the approved list for a Section 8, they do have a voucher and they go to rent an apartment, and then as soon as the person renting the apartment or the owner of the apartment realizes, oh, this is a Section 8, I don't want Section 8 in this building, then they get denied. Their rent application gets denied. So that is an example of a form of discrimination based on the source of income, and in this particular instance, it's Section 8. We're seeing more of those, I would say. Yeah.
We have people, Anita, living in RVs right now who have had Section 8 vouchers for over a year. But they cannot find a place to live. They cannot find a landlord willing to accept the Section 8 voucher, which is really impacting our homeless population and our unhoused brothers and sisters who are struggling to find a place to live. And it's really creating an unfortunate situation where the Section 8 voucher is being devalued. People waiting for that Section 8 voucher to come through, and then over a year or two later, still not being able to find a place to live is a big challenge and a burden for all of Los Angeles.
If someone is experiencing this problem, how do they get in touch with your office?
So folks can reach us on the web at LAIsForEveryone.com. They can call us at 213-978-1845, or they can come down to our offices at the LA Mall, 201 North Los Angeles Street, suite number 6.
Are you guys on social media to get the word out?
Yes, we are. We are proudly on all social media platforms at LA Civil Rights.
Excellent. And you mentioned, before we wrap up, you mentioned LA4All. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. LA4All is an award-winning campaign to send a strong message on the offensive that hate has no home in the city of Los Angeles. It's a campaign in 21 languages. We have blanketed the city in over 5,000 ad spaces, and people can also use our sign in their businesses, dorm rooms, or other places and spaces to send a strong message in 21 languages. Any language they order, they can go to LAIsForEveryone.com/LA4All, and they will have an opportunity to actually request our posters. But we love the campaign, and we have a new campaign coming out soon. I just want to let you know we're going to revamp our very own Just Say Hello campaign. It was something that was created by my husband, actually, and we are very grateful for that campaign being relaunched. So in a few months, we'll have another major campaign to send a strong message of unity in the city of Los Angeles.
And we should mention that your husband, he is very experienced in politics and consulting.
Yeah.
Okay, I've met him before.
Thank you.
Very
He's a big
knowledgeable.
fan.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have learned a lot today. Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation and letting people know that there is help out there. Capri Maddox and Joumana Silyan-Saba of the LA Civil Rights Department. What a conversation, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Excellent.
It was truly a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Well, that is going to do it for this edition of LA Currents. I'm Anita Bennett. Thank you for watching and have a great day.